guys, this is Comic Uno, and today I'm doing Comic Uno's Best Comics of the Week, and this is the show where I review all the comics I've read this week in one show. We go least favorite to best pick of the week and everything in between. And before I get started, we talk about the viewer's pick at the end of the episode, so in the comments below, let me know your pick of the week for a chance to be featured on the episode. There were a ton of big books that came out. Honestly, I was debating what should be the title, because there were just so many big books that came out, but you obviously saw what the title was. It's X-Men. Gotta talk about the end of X-Men. But let's get started. I actually had a pretty solid size haul. It was only about 10 comics, but number 10 for me is Birds of Prey issue 10, a book I honestly really want to enjoy, but there's something preventing me from getting into it, and I think it's mostly just the team dynamic. I want more of the heart and soul of the team, and every single time you get comfortable, they change something up. They introduce a new character, or some character disappears, or they just, there's not moments for that chemistry to build, and I think that's the part for me that is hard for me to connect with this book, even though I think the art is always really interesting. This obviously has a very Spider-Gwen look to it because Robbie Rodriguez is on the title. I like the look of the book. I just cannot find myself to connect to it. I still want to give it more issues because I love the Birds of Prey as a whole and a lot of the characters here, but I want to like this title more than I do. So overall, giving that 1.5 stars, and that is number 10. Moving on to number 9, a book that I was really excited for, but I just don't feel like it stuck the landing, and that is The Amazing Spider-Man issue 51. I like the art for the most part. There is 2 different artists. I enjoy McGinnis's artwork the most here. I think it's the most consistent to what we've been getting, but then you have Todd's art that kind of breaks it apart with the Miss Marvel parts, but there's just not a ton of substance here. I think the concept of Peter becoming a Green Goblin is so interesting, and they just don't really play it up here besides for laughs. And then Miss Marvel, like I said, is kind of thrown in on here where I'm like, oh, we haven't seen Miss Marvel in a long time in this book. Why is she here? She has this interaction with Norman Osborn, who's also just doesn't feel very present, and it just feels like a very scattered book where I think there's a ton of potential to be had because it's an interesting story to see Peter evil. We've seen it, those pieces a little bit in my favorite arc of this series thus far, when we got to see him garner Norman's sins, and I enjoyed that arc, but here it just kind of played for laughs more than anything, and I just don't feel like it works. So overall, giving that 2 stars, and that is number 9. Moving on to number 8, which is Lilo Stitch, issue 4. This is just a fun kind of palette cleanser that I enjoy for my pull list, but this issue is, again, a bit more of a one and done, where Stitch ends up somewhere else without Lilo. Then they finally reconnect in the end of the issue, where I think there's a lot of promise, and then the Galactic Union, we'll call them, I don't know their exact names, they are looking, you think, for Stitch, but they actually want Lilo. I'm like, okay, that's an interesting cliffhanger that'll hopefully bring us to a fun issue 5. So overall, it's a fun book, but there wasn't a ton of substance here. So giving that 3 stars, and that is number 8. Moving on to number 7, which is one of those big books, and that is Scarlett issue 1. I always give this disclaimer. Not a big G.I. Joe fan. Didn't grow up with it. Know nothing about G.I. Joe. But I've been enjoying this universe, and especially Transformers, another franchise I never really got into, but that book in particular has been making me a Transformers fan because I am just a big fan of Warren Johnson's work. And with this, I definitely felt like there was little tidbits here that I enjoyed, and to want to learn more about Scarlett's character, her relationship with this other woman. I'm like, oh, is it just a friendship? Is it a romantic relationship? What's going on here? There's an interesting mystery, all while you get that espionage feel that you're looking for with a G.I. Joe book like this. So as a new reader, I don't know if it said, wow, I gotta read that next issue, but I'm sure there's a lot of tidbits here for G.I. Joe fans. But it did give me enough to want to try out issue 2 to see where this relationship goes. And the artwork is pretty solid for an espionage book. But yeah, I wanna love a G.I. Joe book as someone who's never gotten into G.I. Joe, and I haven't found that just yet. So overall, giving that 3 stars, and that is number 7. All right, we're moving on to the big topic here, and that is X-Men issue 35 / Uncanny X-Men issue 700. This is the last issue of the Krakoa age. And my big question, was the Krakoa age a good era of X-Men? And I think what's so interesting about this age of X-Men is it really is very polarizing for fans. There are people who live and die for Krakoa, and there's people like me who really likes the classic X-Men a little bit more. And I'm not a huge Jonathan Hickman fan. I think besides the, obviously, Ultimate Spider-Man, which I've been loving, I'm usually not a huge fan of his work. I thought House of X, Power of X was solid enough, but it wasn't for me. I respected it, but I wasn't loving it. And that was, probably the strongest aspect of the Krakoa age. And then obviously the big part of Hickman leaving with the whole Substack thing that happened, and then him coming back ruined the flow for me for the Krakoa age to a point where I dropped X-Men for a while, the main series, and then I'm like, all right, it's ending soon. Kitty's back. I'm going to try that out. And I always followed Kitty throughout Marauders and X-Men because she's my favorite X-Men. But, it got too complicated for me. And I, depending on what type of fan you are of the X-Men, you might say there were good character moments. But for me, I missed the soap opera-ness of it. I miss really getting into one specific character story. And I think there's certain miniseries that did that, like Uncanny Nightcrawler or Uncanny, I think it was called Uncanny Spider-Man. That was a really great example of just focusing on one character and being like, okay, this is how unveiling his story. But the main stories, I feel like, focus so much on the world building, honestly, and for me that wasn't the most interesting, and I think it got really prolonged. Even to this, you could kind of feel they're like, well, we're almost to 700, let's just kind of get there. And since the last Hellfire Gala, I'm like, well, when is this age ending? They keep promising this age to end, and I'm just excited to see something new, which also feels like something old with the new era of X-Men. But also something that's so complicated with the X-Men too is the idea of there being so many titles, and you're seeing that a lot with this new era as well. And that almost also made the Krakoa age so hard to follow, because unless you're a hardcore X-Men fan who loved Krakoa and was following every issue, you're like, okay, so what am I reading? Where is this? Oh yeah, that happened in New Mutants. Cool, that happened there. And obviously that's comics in general, but I feel like there's just too many places to follow. Now, speaking on this issue in particular, did it end well? Yeah, I mean, I think it did what you've been following the Krakoa age to do. I liked the morally gray aspect of the characters. I think that's what I enjoyed about Krakoa the most, is that, used to be good Professor Xavier, bad Magneto, and it became a little bit more complicated than that, and the relationship with the humans became more complicated than that, especially maybe even the relationship with the Avengers, because you have characters like Wolverine, who's an Avenger, but then also a mutant, and obviously, along the way, you had Miss Marvel becoming a mutant, who was this beloved character, is now not a beloved character because she's a mutant. So I like that aspect, and I think that plays a big part in this issue, especially with Professor Xavier having a monologue throughout, and everyone kind of expressing, people not liking Xavier, and then you having this kind of cliffhanger that is like, oh, Xavier is dead, and he's not, and of course he's not going to die, and that's going to be this new era of the X-Men, and where is Xavier's spot? But also, I mean, just like comics in general, which is something that I don't love about the superhero comics, is that there's this idea of after this big change, you have to completely go back to what had happened before. And I like when you get some remnants of a previous arc. I think a good example is Valkyrie, like Jane Foster. When she became Thor, there was remnants of her being Thor throughout her journey, and that didn't change. Those stories felt permanent in some way. And I think with this, it's just like, oh yeah, the Krakoa age happened. Maybe we'll go back to it. But for now, that's the end of the chapter, and we're just kind of rebooting the X-Men. And I'm sure Krakoa fans don't love that. And as even a fan of someone who didn't love the Krakoa age, I'm like, well, what did this age mean if we're just kind of putting everything back in the box and doing the same thing over again? So there is a little frustration reading this, but I think they did the best they could ending it, and hopefully Krakoa fans are happy with it. But for me, I thought it was just okay, and giving that 3 stars, and that is number 6. Moving on to number 5, which is Profane. Issue 1, this is a new mystery series. I really like the beginning here where we got to see the voice of this detective. I was like, okay, he's this hard-boiled detective, but he's also exploring this novelist, which feels like very 2 different genres of the murder mystery subgenre of detective stories. So I enjoyed that aspect. It lost me a little bit in the middle where he's like, I don't know what's going on, and it kind of lost its pacing a little bit, but by the end, you get this reveal that he's a fictional character and his author is dead. I'm like, that's a cool concept. I kind of wish I won't say built to it better, because I think there's obviously notions of that happening, but I think the middle could have done a better job at hitting that home a little bit more than it did, but it definitely gave me enough to want to read the next issue. I think it's a very interesting concept with the voice of the character being very heard in this issue. So giving this 3.5 stars, and that is number 5. Moving on to number 4, a book that I'm surprised out of all the issue ones. This is the one I enjoy the most. I'm pleasantly surprised, and that's the Ultimates issue 1. I wasn't a big fan of the beginning of the Ultimate Universe. I don't even remember what it was called at this point, but that mini series, I wasn't a huge fan of it. Like I mentioned, Hickman, I really like Ultimate Spider-Man, but for the most part, I'm not the hugest Hickman fan. But I mean, loving Spider-Man, so I always want to give it a chance. And the beginning of this felt really bogged down. It's like, okay, let's describe the worlds, let's describe why the Ultimate Universe is happening. But the middle is what really got me, when you got to Hank and Janet and just got to see their relationship, and a very similar Spider-Man story where they're like, you were heroes in a different world, and Hank knowing that, and knowing that he could become a bad guy because of it, and him having to make this decision, I thought was the real heart of this issue. And then obviously it's just kind of cool to see them as a team by the end, so it kind of got me by then, where I'm like, oh, I'm enjoying it. You know, I didn't love the bogginess of the beginning, but you really get sucked in by the middle, and then the end, you're like, all right, I'm kind of here for the ride. And the artwork is very reminiscent. I think it's Brian Hitch who does the art here. It's very reminiscent what we've seen from the Ultimates and in this version of the universe thus far. So giving this 3.5 stars, and that is number 4. Moving on to number 3, which is Miss Marvel, the Mutant Menace issue 4. I was talking about this before. I like this issue because it explored a lot of mythology stuff that we've been questioning since Miss Marvel's becoming mutant. What does this mean as an Inhuman for her? And she's still an Inhuman. It gets a little complicated by the middle, where it's like, you're not a mutant anymore because you died and you got to do this and this and that. And I think the most complicated part is trying to explain that in one issue, knowing this is a mini-series. And I'm like, just give Miss Marvel an ongoing series at this point. You keep relaunching these mini-series, and it kind of kills the story momentum a little bit, because you do feel the rushingness of it in this issue. But I liked what was being told here. I enjoyed Miss Marvel kind of figuring out what she stands for and who she is. I don't love that everyone hates Miss Marvel now. That's not a big part that I enjoyed by the end. And I guess the part I also, again, scratching my head a little bit, because it's a mini-series, is that it ends there. It ends, friends hate Miss Marvel, and this character might die. And I'm like, wow, like, I wish there was a promised another mini-series so I could see where this is going to go. Even though I'm sure there will be a mini-series, I feel like that was such a big cliffhanger. So overall, I give it 3.5 stars. There's some parts I really, really enjoyed, but then there's some parts where I think because of the scheduling and the way this had to be published, it had a little bit of, it had some hiccups because of that. So giving that 3.5 stars, and that is number 3. Moving on to number 2, which is Batman issue 148. And this is just a fun action issue. Finally, we kind of get to a point, hopefully the end of Failsafe. I like seeing who's behind Failsafe. I think that was probably the most interesting part of his whole arc. But why I like this is just the Bat family working together and being like, hey, we're stronger as a team to defeat Failsafe. Maybe he'll be around again, maybe he won't. It's the end of the arc. Is it mind-blowing? No. But is the arc good? Is the team dynamic good? Yeah, I had a fun time as an action issue for this one. So overall, giving that one 3.5 stars, and that is number 2. Moving on to number 1, I've been loving this series, especially since the new creative team has taken over, and that is Shazam issue 12. If you're looking for pure superhero fun, this one does that for you. There's so much soap opera-ness in this that I really, really enjoy, where you get to see Billy have this conflict between him and Shazam, or / Captain Marvel, and we see the world of Shazam kind of breaking apart because of something happening. You find out it's because of Billy's turmoil, and more turmoil happens when he finds out his mother, who left him, is actually a okay person now and just doesn't want Billy and has a new kid, and Billy feels like he's in shambles and has ruined the adoption for his family and just not doing well, and he kind of leaves, and he's like, all right, fam, you could have Shazam now. Billy's out. And I thought this was just a really fun, again, dramatic issue that does a really good job with character work, some really, really solid facial expressions with the art. It just feels like it's doing everything it can to make a wonderful Shazam story, which I believe these characters really deserve. So 4 stars for me. Really, really solid issue. Let me know in the comments below what your pick of the week was. Last week's viewer pick of the week was Gomritz issue 1, and here are some comments about that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. This is Comic Uno, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.